Ever had one of those bonds, where you'd face anything for that person?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, that's what we're diving into today, this incredible connection between Achilles and Patroclus.
A story that's it's captivated people for centuries, really. This relationship, it goes way beyond simple definitions. I mean, it's fueled epic poetry, philosophical debates, even inspired leaders like Alexander the Great.
And we've got a lot to unpack here. We're talking Homer's Iliad, obviously, that's where it all starts. But then we're going to look at, glimpses we get from later Greek plays and even Shakespeare's take on them.
What's so fascinating is that it's not just retelling the Trojan War, right? It's more about like how their bond has been seen throughout history. It's really about like changing ideas of love, heroism, and just, what it means to be devoted to another person.
So, basics first.
Yeah.
Who was Achilles? Everyone knows about the heel, right?
Yes.
That one weak spot. But there's so much more to him.
Yeah, he was almost like a demigod, born from a goddess, Thetis, and a mortal king. And even his birth was like surrounded by prophecy and a little bit of divine anxiety, I'd say.
So the gods were kind of nervous about this powerful demigod. Like it would mess things up.
Totally. The fear was if a god fathered him, right, he might become too powerful, like even challenge Zeus himself. So to avoid that, they made sure Thetis married a mortal. So extraordinary, yes, but not a threat to the whole, like, divine order.
But still destined for greatness and a tragic early death. That's rough.
Yeah, knowing your end is waiting for you on the battlefield definitely adds a layer, right? Makes you think about free will, destiny, how we deal with the inevitable.
Before we get to the Trojan War stuff, there's that story, him being hidden among women, right? Seems ironic for a warrior.
Oh, for sure. When Greece called for heroes to sail for Troy, his family, they tried to protect him, dressed him up as a woman on the island of Skyros.
Can you imagine that? This warrior to be surrounded by, like, silks and jewels?
But that warrior nature, it just couldn't be hidden. Odysseus, the crafty one, famous for his wit, he saw through it, laid out all these fine gifts and weapons, then staged a mock attack, and bam, Achilles instinctively grabbed a sword.
Like his true self just took over, even when hidden. I think that speaks to anyone who's ever felt pressure to fit in, right?
Yeah.
Be someone they're not. Like your true nature, it kind of shines through.
Yeah, a timeless struggle, that societal expectations versus who we really are. Many people can relate to that.
So Achilles eventually joins the Greeks, brings his Myrmidons, right?
Right.
Those fierce warriors. And with them, the guy we're really focusing on, Patroclus.
And he becomes so much more than just a fellow soldier, confidante, advisor, a skilled horseman. And their relationship, that's what's kept people talking for all this time.
Even Homer in the Iliad, he doesn't really define what they were.
Right? Nope. And that ambiguity, that's part of what makes it so interesting. Lovers, close companions, or like something else entirely. The text leaves it open, which is why later writers and artists, they'd put their own ideas about love onto them.
And we know ancient Greek ideas about love, intimacy, especially between men, were pretty different, right?
Oh, completely. There's this story, maybe more myth than fact, but it says Poseidon, the god, he was kind of smitten with Patroclus, personally taught him horsemanship. True or not, it shows how their bond attracted these grand, almost mythical embellishments, adding to the whole mystery.
So their connection almost like this blank canvas for exploring human relationships, right?
Okay.
Trojan War time, Greeks are struggling, Achilles famously refusing to fight after that whole Agamemnon mess. For our listeners, this wasn't just a squabble. It was about, like, honor. Agamemnon took Phryses, a woman who was rightfully Achilles' prize.
Deeply wronged, he felt. It was public humiliation, stripped of his honor, his status. Furious he was.
So angry won't fight.
Huge problem for the Greeks, right? Their best warriors gone, Trojans start winning.
And Patroclus, he sees his friend struggling, can't just watch.
Exactly. He pleads with Achilles, begs him, at least let me wear your armor, lead the Myrmidons, push back the Trojans, give the Greeks some hope.
Achilles, torn between his anger and his worry for Patroclus, his comrades, he finally agrees. But he's not happy about it.
Yeah, he senses trouble. Like a premonition. This decision could end badly.
Makes Patroclus promise, don't go too far, just defend the ships. A promise, of course, that's broken.
Oh, yeah. Battle frenzy, underestimating the danger, who knows? He pushes the Trojans back to the walls of Troy, directly disobeys Achilles.
And that defiance, it has consequences. Big ones. He runs into Hector, the Trojan prince, and, well, it doesn't end well for Patroclus.
That clash, Patroclus and Hector, it's like a turning point in the Iliad. This moment of just unbearable grief that sends Achilles on a rampage of revenge.
News of Patroclus' death, it hits Achilles hard, like something snaps. That rage, you can almost feel it.
Oh, Homer describes it so well. Raw, consuming grief instantly becomes this burning need for vengeance. Make the Trojans pay.
And we see that vengeance, right? The way he kills Hector. Brutal.
Goes beyond just defeating him. Mutilates the body, drags it around Patroclus's funeral pyre. Even for ancient warfare, that's horrific. Shows how deep his grief and rage were.
Like losing Patroclus just unleashed something primal. Even the gods were like, whoa, too far. But even in this grief, he honors Patroclus with this elaborate funeral.
Oh, totally. The pyre itself, it shows his love, his sorrow, built high, filled with offerings, sheep, cattle, war horses, even sacrifices some of Patroclus's dogs.
The dogs, too. Why?
The ancient belief was these animals would join Patroclus in the afterlife, keep him company.
It's beautiful and sad all at once.
Exactly. And along with the animals, another sacrifice. 12 Trojan prisoners. Shows the brutality of the times, how intense his grief was.
A level of grief, a desire for payback, almost impossible to imagine. But before the funeral happens, something strange occurs.
You're talking about Patroclus's ghost visiting Achilles, right?
Right. What do you make of that?
It adds this supernatural connection to their bond. The ghost doesn't want revenge. He just wants to be buried so his soul can rest. And he asks for something specific. Wants their bones mingled together in the same urn after death.
Wow. That's powerful. What does that say about their connection?
Says a lot. It's a bond that goes beyond death itself. They want to stay together even in the afterlife. Amazing.
So Achilles gets his revenge on Hector. But, of course, he doesn't survive the war.
Nope. Paris, Hector's brother, gets him with an arrow, right in the heel. Fulfills the prophecy, right? The irony of being almost invincible.
And that last wish didn't happen. Were their bones actually buried together?
Tradition says yes. Their shared tomb became this, pilgrimage site. People honored their legendary bond there. And centuries later, Alexander the Great, he was drawn to it. He saw himself and Hephaestion, his companion, as a reflection of them.
Ah, right. Alexander the Great. We mentioned him. He wasn't just a fan. He explicitly modeled his relationship on theirs.
It shows how powerful their story became, how it went beyond just history. Became this emblem of, passionate friendship, loyalty, inspired people for generations.
And their story didn't just stay the same, right? It's been reinterpreted so many times. Like Aeschylus's play, The Myrmidons. Sadly, we only have bits and pieces, but we know it showed their relationship as, well, pretty erotic.
For sure. Aeschylus, he didn't shy away from the physical intimacy. He actually focuses on Achilles lamenting the loss of Patroclus's thighs, a clear reference to, desire in ancient Greek culture.
Their story, almost like a mirror, reflecting how ideas of love and intimacy have changed.
Exactly, and even back then, it sparked debate. Plato, in his Symposium, he gives a different interpretation, argues Achilles was the younger, more passionate lover.
So even in ancient Greece, people saw their bond differently.
Absolutely. What's interesting is that even though their relationship was clearly intense, passionate, deeply emotional, it wasn't seen as bad or scandalous back then. It kind of transcended the categories and judgments that later societies would put on same-sex relationships.
Before we get to more modern interpretations, what about ancient Greek art? We know their story was popular. What kind of imagery do we see?
Well, the typical battle scenes, those dominate depictions of Achilles, there are some really touching portrayals of them together. There's one image, really poignant, of them tending to each other's wounds. Shows a different side of their relationship.
A beautiful image. Reminds us they weren't just warriors, but individuals capable of deep care.
Exactly. It's those quieter moments, the vulnerability and intimacy that make their story so lasting.
Even amidst the brutality of war, human connection can still flourish.
Precisely. And those connections can reveal so much about a person beyond simple labels or categories.
So we have Homer's somewhat ambiguous portrayal, Aeschylus leaning into the erotic aspects, and Plato offering his own take. Their story becomes this canvas for different ideas about love and intimacy.
And it went on well beyond ancient Greece. Throughout the Roman period and after, they became this archetype of a virtuous, even heroic homoerotic relationship. Interesting, considering how attitudes towards same-sex relationships shifted, often became more restrictive over time.
It's like their story provided this framework for exploring these themes in a way that was relatable and, in some ways, transgressive, especially in cultures where homosexuality faced, scrutiny and prejudice.
Exactly. Their bond offered a counter-narrative to the often negative stereotypes associated with same-sex relationships, allowed for a more nuanced and, I'd say, more humanizing portrayal of love between men.
Okay, to see how their story has been reinterpreted through different lenses we have to jump ahead. Shakespeare.
Yeah.
How does he handle them in Troilus and Cressida?
Shakespeare's interpretation is different. It's definitely more sexual, and there's this hint of negativity, a sense of judgment you don't see in earlier works. One character even calls Patroclus Achilles masculine whore, which is pretty jarring compared to, the idealized depictions we've been talking about.
That's harsh. What caused this change in perspective?
It probably reflects how social attitudes towards same-sex relationships were changing or maybe devolving during Shakespeare's time. Ancient Greece had a more fluid understanding. Elizabethan England, much more rigid, judgmental about sexuality.
So less about the historical Achilles and Patroclus and more about Shakespeare's era and their anxieties being projected onto the story.
That's a good point. It reminds us that even timeless stories are viewed through the lens of the time they're told.
Makes you wonder how their story might be interpreted today with our current cultural landscape. Something to think about.
Definitely. But one thing's for sure, the story of Achilles and Patroclus, with all its nuances, will keep fascinating people for a long time. Their bond, it speaks to something universal, something that transcends time and culture.
Agreed. But before we go into those broader themes, let's talk history. What can we learn about real-life relationships between men in ancient Greece?
Now things get interesting. Ancient Greece, very different social structure, and their understanding of sexuality, it's not what most people are used to today.
Different how?
For one thing, same-sex relationships between men were fairly common, especially among the elite, often seen as a natural part of, a young man's education and development.
So not taboo, not something to hide.
Not necessarily. Of course, there were social norms, but it wasn't automatically stigmatized or condemned the way it might have been later on.
Fascinating. But were these relationships all about, physical intimacy, or was there more to it?
That's the big question, and historians still debate it. What we know for sure is these relationships often mixed mentorship, physical attraction, and a deep emotional connection.
So more than just lovers or friends.
Exactly. The ancient Greeks, they had different terms for these relationships, which really blurred the lines between what we might consider friendship and romance today.
So how does this apply to Achilles and Patroclus? Did it tell us anything about how their bond might have been seen back then?
It adds a layer of understanding, definitely. While Homer doesn't explicitly define their relationship, knowing that same-sex relationships were not only accepted, but even, in some cases, encouraged, it allows us to, see their interactions in a new light.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into a world where love and intimacy weren't confined to the strict categories we have today.
That's a good way to put it. And this fluidity, this openness to different forms of love, it might be part of why their story is so enduring. It speaks to that very human desire for connection that goes beyond labels.
Makes you wonder if our modern obsession with categories, friend, lover, straight, gay, if it actually limits our understanding of relationships.
Very insightful. It's possible that by trying to fit everything into boxes, we miss out on the richness and complexity of real connections.
Okay, so we've got the ancient Greek context. But what about their broader legacy? We mentioned Alexander the Great, but how else have they influenced Western culture?
Oh, their influence is huge. Their names, they've become synonymous with, profound friendship, loyalty that lasts beyond death, and a love that defies categories. Their story has inspired countless works of art, literature, music. It still captures our imaginations today.
It's amazing a story from thousands of years ago still has this power.
It really is. It's because of the universal themes: love, loss, sacrifice, the bonds that unite us. These are human experiences that go beyond time and culture.
And it's not just romantic love, right? It's about the deep connections we make, the people who shape who we are, how we deal with life's challenges.
Exactly. Achilles and Patroclus, they remind us that these bonds can be a source of incredible strength and support, but also immense pain when they're broken.
It forces us to confront those big questions about love, loyalty, and experiencing grief so deeply that it can both break and change us. These are themes that still resonate, whether you're reading the Iliad for the first time or watching a modern film inspired by their story.
Absolutely. Even though they were warriors from a distant past, their struggles, their triumphs, their tragedies, they feel relevant to our own lives.
So even though their world was different, their story reflects our experiences. It makes us think about our own relationships and the legacies we leave behind.
Beautiful way to put it. And before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we should look at their individual characters more closely. We've talked about their bond, but how do their personalities, their traits, shape their destinies?
Good point. They weren't just symbols. They were individuals with flaws, passions, vulnerabilities. And that's part of what makes them so relatable, so human.
Exactly. And I think it's those individual characteristics that still resonate with us today. We see echoes of Achilles' passion and Patroclus' wisdom in so many stories and characters.
Right. It's as if their story is a blueprint for exploring the complexities of human relationships, especially between men, with all the messiness and contradictions.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is how their story has been used to both challenge and reinforce ideas about masculinity and male friendship.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, on one hand, their story has been embraced by those who see it as a celebration of same-sex love, a testament to relationships that defy easy categories.
Right. We talked about how their story became a symbol of virtuous homoerotic love in ancient Rome, even as attitudes toward same-sex relationships were becoming more restrictive.
Exactly. And more recently, their story has been reclaimed by LGBTQ plus communities as a symbol of love, acceptance, and pushing back against societal norms that try to limit love based on rigid categories.
Their bond offers a different perspective, a reminder that love can exist in many forms, and those forms should be celebrated.
Precisely. But on the other hand, their story has also been used to reinforce more traditional ideas about masculinity, particularly in military
So,
contexts.
so.
Their bond is often framed as this model of brotherhood, emphasizing loyalty, sacrifice, and camaraderie against a common enemy.
So the focus shifts to their shared experiences as warriors, their commitment to a cause.
Exactly. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with celebrating those values, it's important to acknowledge that this interpretation can sometimes downplay or even erase the homoerotic subtext that's there in their story.
It becomes more about promoting a specific kind of masculinity, one that values strength, stoicism, holding back emotions.
Exactly. And this is why it's crucial to engage with their story completely, recognizing both the heroic and the intimate aspects of the relationship without trying to force them into a box that doesn't capture their complexity.
It's a good reminder that relationships, especially those forged in war, don't fit into neat categories.
Absolutely. And it's in those gray areas where love, friendship, and loyalty intersect that we often find the most compelling stories.
And it's those nuances that we'll keep exploring in the next part of our deep dives.
Stay tuned. We'll go deeper into the legacy of Achilles and Patroclus. We'll look at how their story has resonated throughout history and how it continues to shape our understanding of love, loss, and loyalty.
We were just talking about how their story, Achilles and Patroclus, it's been used to both challenge and reinforce these ideas about masculinity, right?
Hmm.
Amazing how something so old still fits into these conversations we're having now.
It really shows how powerful their story is. Thousands of years later, we're still asking those same questions about love, loyalty, how society shapes what we think about those things.
So to really get those nuances, we got to look closer at them as individuals, right? We know Achilles, the warrior, almost unbeatable, but what else? What drove him? What made him vulnerable?
Achilles, he's fascinating because he's full of contradictions, driven by honor, glory, amazing warrior, but also that temper, that rage, sometimes leads him to do things he probably shouldn't.
Like with Agamemnon, right?
You
That
bet.
whole thing, feeling disrespected, and he just walks away from the war,
Yeah.
putting the whole Greek campaign at risk.
Exactly. His pride, that need to be recognized, it was both his strength and his downfall, I'd say. But under all that warrior stuff, the rage, the need for glory, there was this deep capacity for love, for loyalty, burned just as intensely as his anger.
And that's where Patroclus comes in. He seems to have a different kind of strength, a quiet wisdom that often calmed Achilles down.
Yeah, Patroclus, he's usually seen as the more level-headed one, compassionate, thoughtful, devoted to Achilles. He had this calming presence, a wisdom that let him advise Achilles, give him perspective when things got too heated.
So they balanced each other out, like Achilles, the fire, the force, and Patroclus, the grounding, the voice of reason.
That's a great way to put it. They completed each other's strengths and weaknesses, and it created this dynamic, powerful, and, well, tragic in the end.
Makes you think, what if the Trojan War hadn't happened? Could they have, had a life together outside all that conflict, the threat of death?
It's a good question. It's possible that the war itself, the danger, the constant possibility of losing each other, it made the bond stronger, more intense. Maybe in peacetime their story would have been different.
Interesting how external stuff can shape our relationships, how hard times can sometimes bring people closer.
Absolutely. Their story reminds us that even in chaos, destruction, love, and loyalty can not only survive, but thrive. Their bond was like a light in a very dark world.
Speaking of their legacy, we've talked about how their story was seen differently through time. The ancient Greeks, the Romans seeing it as a virtuous model, even as things were getting stricter for same-sex relationships.
Yeah, and it's amazing how it's continued to evolve, often reflecting those social anxieties, the changing norms of each era, like the
Yeah.
contrast between those earlier interpretations in Shakespeare and Troilus and Cressida, much more sexual, and there's a negativity there, almost a judgment.
Yeah, Shakespeare's version felt like it was more about his time, Elizabethan England, and their hang-ups about same-sex relationships than about the actual Achilles and Patroclus.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to understand the context, the historical time a story is told in, how social norms can color our interpretation.
Makes you appreciate that fluidity, that acceptance in ancient Greece
Yeah.
about same-sex relationships. Their bond wasn't seen as inherently bad or shameful, just another way humans connect.
You got it. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from their story. It makes us examine our own assumptions about love, intimacy, and to see that relationships, they don't always fit into neat categories.
It's about embracing the complexity of human connection, recognizing that love can exist in many forms, even forms that challenge what society expects.
Exactly. And I think that's why their story still resonates with people today across cultures. It speaks to something fundamental, the need for love, connection, acceptance.
A powerful message, especially in a world that often tries to divide us, label us, limit how we understand love.
So true. Their story encourages us to be more open-minded, more accepting, to celebrate the many ways humans can love each other.
As we move into the last part of our deep dive, let's focus on how their story's been seen more recently. How has their legacy evolved in the modern world?
That's a great question, and we'll definitely explore that next. But I can tell you, their story continues to inspire artists, writers, filmmakers, reimagine in so many ways, from novels to films, even video games.
So they've become this inspiration for exploring love, loss, sacrifice, letting modern audiences connect with these ancient figures.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how their story's been embraced by certain communities, especially the LGBTQ plus community. It's become a symbol of love, acceptance, pushing back against those norms that try to limit love based on rigid categories.
Their bond, it gives a different perspective, reminds us that love can exist in so many ways, and we should celebrate that, not condemn it.
You said it. And I think that's why their story is still relevant, even essential today. It makes us think critically about how we define love, how we see masculinity, and how we build a world where everyone feels seen, valued, loved for who they are.
Things that we'll definitely get into more in the next part of our deep dive, but for now, something for our listeners to think about. What stories from your own life connect with these themes? What relationships have shaped you, challenged, or affirmed those societal norms?
Good questions to ponder. We'll be back soon to continue exploring Achilles and Patroclus. We'll see how their story has resonated in modern times and how it continues to challenge our understanding of love, loyalty, and the power of human connection.
Back again, still diving deep into Achilles and Patroclus, their legacy. We've gone from ancient Greece, how their story changed through history.
And now we're looking at how it's resonated in modern times, how it's inspiring artists, writers, filmmakers, and how it's being used to, challenge those norms, start conversations about love, identity, acceptance.
It's amazing, right? A story from so long ago still feels so relevant today to our struggles, our successes.
It's about the things we all experience, I think. Love, loss, loyalty, sacrifice. These things, they go beyond time, culture, everything. And it shows the power of stories, how these ancient tales can still, teach us about ourselves, the world.
So where do we see their influence now? How has their story been, reimagined in recent times? Give us some examples.
Well, one of the most obvious is literature, right? So many novels, plays, poems, they all take inspiration from Achilles and Patroclus, exploring love, war, those complex male relationships, but through a modern lens.
Some stick to the original, some get creative, right?
Yeah.
Use them as a starting point to talk about current issues.
Exactly. Some writers, they use the story to look at, the effects of war on the mind, the trauma of battle, the difficulties of, intense relationships in a violent world.
Others use it as a metaphor for, forbidden love, the fight for acceptance, being brave enough to defy those societal rules.
It's fascinating to see how different writers approach it, how they weave these ancient themes into stories that speak to us today.
And it's not just books, right? Film, Television, too. We've had several Iliad adaptations. Some focus on the battles, the politics. Others go deeper into the characters' relationships, especially Achilles and Patroclus.
And some filmmakers, they use it as a background to explore modern conflicts, drawing parallels between the Trojan War and today's struggles for power, justice, identity.
Their story is like this rich source of themes, characters. You can use it to tell stories that are both timeless and relevant to right now.
Exactly. And one of the most important things recently is how the LGBTQ plus community has reclaimed their story.
Right, right. We talked about that a bit. How has their relationship become this symbol for the community?
Well, as society's views on same-sex relationships have changed, there's been this push to reinterpret history in a more inclusive way. And their story, with that homoerotic subtext, it's become this powerful symbol of love, acceptance, rejecting those norms that try to, define love based on gender, orientation.
It's like they offer a counter-narrative to those limiting definitions of love, right?
Mhm.
Love can exist in many ways, and those ways should be celebrated, not shut down.
You got it. And that's why it resonates so strongly with LGBTQ plus people. It validates, gives a historical precedent for same-sex love, challenges that idea that it's a modern thing or unnatural.
It reminds us that love in all its forms has always been there, and we should be celebrating that, not trying to hide it or erase it.
Absolutely. As we work towards a more inclusive, accepting world, their story reminds us love has no boundaries. And those who defy those norms, they're often the ones who leave the most lasting impact.
It makes us think, really think, about how we define love, how we see masculinity, how we build a world where everyone feels seen, valued, loved for who they are.
And that's a beautiful thought to end on, I think.
I agree. It's been amazing exploring this legacy of Achilles and Patroclus. Their story from ancient Greece still burns bright today. It inspires us to embrace those complex connections, to work towards a better, more compassionate world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Don't forget to subscribe for more explorations of history, culture, the human experience. We'll bring the sources, you bring the curiosity, and together we'll keep diving deeper.